What happens when the most powerful institutions in a democracy explain the use of lethal force, and people don't feel convinced? On January 7, 2026, a woman named Renee Good was shot and killed during a federal law enforcement encounter in Minneapolis. Within hours, officials offered an explanation. The officer involved acted in self-defense. In many cases, that statement would have ended the story. But this time, it didn't. Instead, it opened something quieter and far more difficult to resolve. Questions. Not only about what happened in those moments, but about why so many people almost instinctively doubted the explanation they were given. This documentary is not about deciding guilt. It is not about declaring innocence. And it is not about replacing an investigation with outrage. It is about understanding why trust fractures when power explains itself. Because across democracies, whether in the United States, Europe, Africa, or elsewhere, there is a pattern that repeats itself. When state authority uses lethal force, legality alone is no longer enough. People want clarity, they want transparency. And they want explanations that feel proportional to the gravity of what occurred. The phrase self-defense carries legal meaning. It recognizes that officers may face real danger and are sometimes forced to make split-second decisions under stress. That reality matters. It cannot be ignored. But so does another reality. When the state takes a life, the burden of explanation is heavier. Not because officers are presumed guilty, but because power demands accountability. In the Renee Good case, the explanation arrived quickly. Officials described a threat. They described danger. They described a moment that required immediate action. Yet almost immediately, alternative accounts began circulating. Video footage, eyewitness statements, statements from local leaders. Each added layers of uncertainty. Not all of them agreed with one another, but together they created something that official statements alone could not fully address. Doubt. This doubt did not emerge in a vacuum. It was shaped by memory, by previous incidents where initial explanations were later revised, challenged, or contradicted. It was shaped by a public that has learned over time to listen carefully, not just to what is said, but to what is left unsaid. And that is where this story truly begins. Not with a gunshot, not with a press conference, but with the space between an explanation and belief. Because when governments explain lethal force, they are not speaking only to courts, they are speaking to the public. And the public measures those explanations not just by legal standards, but by credibility. This case forces a difficult question, one that extends far beyond a single city or agency. What standard should exist when the state explains why someone died? Is it enough that an action fits within policy? Or must the explanation also satisfy a public that increasingly expects transparency, context, and evidence? These are not abstract concerns. They shape how societies understand authority itself. When explanations feel complete and credible, trust holds. When they feel rushed, opaque, or defensive, trust erodes, even before investigations conclude. In the hours and days after Renee Good's death, that erosion became visible. Protests emerged. Officials disagreed publicly. Federal and local authorities diverged in tone and emphasis, and the word self-defense, meant to clarify, instead became the center of debate. This documentary does not seek to resolve that debate. It seeks to document it. To examine what is known, what is claimed, and what remains unanswered. To explore how language, timing, and institutional structure influence belief. and to ask why in moments like this, clarity often lags behind consequence. Because the most important question may not be whether self-defense was claimed. It may be why so many people felt the need to question it. Every official explanation begins with language. In the hours following the death of Renee Good, federal authorities moved quickly to describe what had happened. Their central claim was concise and legally familiar. An officer, they said, acted in self-defense. Those two words did heavy work. They framed the event as a reaction, not an initiation. They suggested immediacy, danger, and necessity. And they placed the incident inside an established legal category, one designed to explain why force, even lethal force, may sometimes be justified. In official statements, the emphasis was on threat perception. Authorities described a rapidly unfolding encounter, a situation they said left little time for deliberation. The officer, according to the federal account, believed his life or the lives of others were in danger and responded accordingly. This framing matters. In democratic systems, self-defense is not simply an excuse. It is a doctrine. It acknowledges that law enforcement officers may face unpredictable risks and must sometimes act in seconds, not minutes. When invoked, it signals that the state views the use of force as reactive, constrained, and legally defensible. And yet, official explanations do more than inform courts. They also shape public understanding. In the Renee Good case, the speed of the explanation became part of the story. Within a short window, a definitive label had been applied, before all available evidence was made public, before independent review was complete, and before local authorities had access to the full investigative record. For some viewers, that speed conveyed confidence. For others, it conveyed closure, too early. This is where language begins to diverge from perception. Official statements often rely on institutional vocabulary: perceived threat, use of force, officer safety. These terms are precise within policy frameworks, but distant from everyday experience. To the public, they can sound abstract, especially when paired with irreversible outcomes. When officials say self-defense, they are making a legal claim, but audiences often hear something else, a conclusion. That gap between explanation and interpretation is not unique to this case. It appears repeatedly in incidents involving state violence, and it raises a question that sits at the heart of public trust. When is an explanation informative, and when does it feel final? In Minneapolis, local leaders reacted differently from federal officials. Some questioned not only the conclusion but the process by which it was reached. They asked why state and city investigators were excluded from early stages of evidence review. They asked why video footage was not immediately released in full. And they asked why the language of certainty arrived before transparency. These questions did not assert wrongdoing. They asserted uncertainty. And uncertainty, when met with definitive statements, can deepen skepticism rather than resolve it. From the federal perspective, early statements may have been intended to calm public concern and clarify intent. In moments of crisis, institutions often move quickly to define events, to prevent speculation from filling the void. But the risk of early framing is that it can harden narratives before all facts are visible. Once a label like self-defense enters public discourse, every subsequent detail is filtered through it, either reinforcing the claim or challenging it. That dynamic played out rapidly here. As video clips circulated and eyewitness accounts emerged, the official explanation remained unchanged. Federal agencies reiterated their position, emphasizing training, threat assessment, and policy compliance. Local officials, meanwhile, emphasized review, access, and oversight. Two conversations were happening at once. One focused on legality, the other focused on legitimacy. And between them sat a public trying to reconcile both. This documentary does not dispute that officers can face danger. It does not deny that self-defense is a recognized and sometimes necessary justification. But it does observe how the timing, language, and certainty of official explanations shape public reaction. Because when explanations feel complete before evidence feels visible, trust becomes fragile. In the next segment, we step away from statements and into context, examining what is known about the setting, the encounter, and the moments that followed. Not to draw conclusions, but to understand why the official account alone did not settle the story. To understand why the official account did not settle public doubt, it helps to step away from statements and return to the physical setting where the encounter unfolded. On January 7, 2026, federal immigration agents were conducting an operation in South Minneapolis. The area was not a remote or restricted zone. It was a lived-in neighborhood, streets, sidewalks, nearby buildings, and passing civilians. An ordinary environment, interrupted by an extraordinary moment. At some point during this operation, agents encountered Renee Good, who was inside a vehicle. What happened next unfolded quickly, and much of it remains contested. But several elements of the scene are not in dispute. The encounter occurred outdoors in daylight or early evening conditions. Multiple agents were present. Vehicles, both official and civilian, were nearby. And within moments, the situation escalated from an encounter to a fatal shooting. This physical context matters. Encounters involving vehicles are among the most complex and dangerous scenarios in law enforcement. A car can be transportation, shelter, or, under certain interpretations, a weapon. How officers position themselves, how close they stand, and how they interpret movement all factor into threat assessment. In this case, federal officials later stated that the officer perceived an immediate danger connected to the vehicle. They emphasized proximity and speed, arguing that the moment allowed little room for alternatives. However, public attention quickly focused on a different set of details: positioning. Video footage and still frames circulated online showed officers standing close to the vehicle. To some viewers, this raised questions. Why were agents positioned where they could be endangered? Was there space to step back? Were verbal commands issued clearly and consistently? These questions do not presume wrongdoing. They reflect how civilians evaluate risk differently from trained officers, and how visual evidence invites scrutiny. Another point of focus was timing. The interval between initial contact and the use of lethal force appears to have been brief, seconds, not minutes. In law enforcement terms, that brevity can justify rapid decisions. In public perception, it can feel abrupt, especially when the outcome is irreversible. After the shooting, emergency response followed. The area was secured, investigators arrived, and information began to move through separate channels: federal, local, media, and social networks, often at different speeds. This is where the scene extends beyond geography. The immediate aftermath became part of the narrative. Local officials reported being restricted in their access to evidence. Federal agencies retained control of key materials, and the public watching from outside saw fragments, short video clips, partial statements, still images captured from phones. Fragmentation matters. When people receive information in pieces, they attempt to assemble meaning on their own. In the absence of full context, gaps become questions, and questions can harden into suspicion. Importantly, this does not mean every question has an answer available to the public. Investigations often require confidentiality. Evidence must be reviewed, timelines reconstructed. But when a scene produces visual evidence, especially evidence that appears to challenge official descriptions, expectations change. Transparency is no longer optional in the public mind. It becomes a perceived obligation. In the Renee Good case, the physical scene, agent's vehicle, street, became a focal point for interpretation. Viewers paused frames, replayed moments, debated angles and distances. None of this replaced an investigation, but it influenced belief. And belief, once formed, shapes reaction. This is why the scene matters as much as the statements that followed. Because physical reality is harder to abstract than language. People may not understand policy, but they understand space, motion, and proximity. Standing too close, moving too fast, firing too quickly. Whether those interpretations are accurate is for investigators to determine, but their existence explains why the official explanation alone did not quiet the conversation. The scene did not speak with one voice. It spoke through fragments. In the next segment, we turn to those fragments themselves, examining the role of video and visual evidence, and why footage can clarify some questions while intensifying others. In modern conflicts between authority and public trust, video has become a decisive witness. Not because it tells the full story, but because it tells something. And once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. In the aftermath of the shooting that killed Renee Good, short video clips began circulating online. Some were captured by bystanders. Others were fragments shared through news broadcasts or social platforms. None on their own claimed to be definitive, but together they shaped perception. Video has a unique power. It compresses time, it flattens complexity, and it invites interpretation from viewers who were not present and do not share the training, stress, or information available to officers in the moment. This is both its strength and its danger. In the clips that emerged, viewers focused on a few recurring details: the position of officers around the vehicle, the movement of the car, and the speed with which the encounter escalated. These visual cues became reference points, paused, replayed, debated. To some, the footage appeared to show an imminent threat. To others, it appeared ambiguous. That divergence is not accidental. Video rarely captures intent. It captures angles, distance, motion, and sound, often incompletely. Context exists outside the frame. Radio communication, prior warnings, internal assessments, and split-second judgments that cameras cannot record. Yet public reaction does not wait for context. Once footage circulates, it competes with official explanations. If the two align, trust is reinforced. If they appear to diverge, doubt expands. In this case, many viewers felt the video did not clearly support the certainty of the self-defense claim. The footage did not resolve questions about proximity. It did not conclusively show unavoidable danger. And it did not provide a continuous, unbroken view of the encounter. That absence became significant. When authorities assert clarity but footage appears partial or inconclusive, audiences sense imbalance. They do not necessarily conclude deception, but they do question completeness. It is important to say this plainly. Video is not evidence of guilt or innocence by itself. Investigators use footage alongside forensic data, testimony, and timelines. The public, however, often treats video as primary truth because it feels immediate and unmediated. This creates tension. Officials may know more than the public may see something officials cannot ignore. Both realities coexist. In the Renee Good case, footage functioned less as proof and more as catalyst. It did not answer the central question, but it made it unavoidable. It forced viewers to ask not only what happened, but whether everything had been shown. And once that question takes hold, it changes the relationship between explanation and belief. Another factor compounded this effect: the absence of comprehensive official video release in the early stages. Whether due to policy, investigation protocol, or interagency jurisdiction, the delay meant that unofficial clips dominated the conversation. Partial images filled the void. This is a familiar pattern in the digital age. When information is incomplete, people do not wait. They infer. They compare. They remember similar cases. And memory shapes interpretation as much as footage does. None of this means the official account is false. It means the visual record did not feel sufficient to confirm it. That distinction matters, because public trust does not depend on certainty. It depends on perceived openness. When footage exists, people expect to see it. When they cannot, they ask why. In this way, video becomes less about what it shows and more about what remains unseen. As investigators continue their work, footage will be analyzed frame by frame, context will be added, timelines clarified. That process takes time. Public judgment, however, often forms much faster. The challenge for institutions is not simply to investigate correctly, but to communicate in a way that acknowledges what people have already seen. In the next segment, we step away from images and examine the law itself, what self-defense means in legal terms, especially in encounters involving vehicles, and why legal thresholds often collide with public intuition. To understand why the phrase self-defense became the center of this case, it helps to step away from emotion and examine what the law actually means when that term is used. Self-defense is not a feeling, it is a legal standard. In U.S. law, self-defense allows the use of force, including lethal force, when an individual reasonably believes they are facing an imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. For law enforcement officers, this standard is shaped by training, policy, and court precedent. Officers are not required to be correct in their perception of danger, but their belief must be considered reasonable under the circumstances. That word, reasonable, does much of the work. It asks whether another trained officer placed in the same situation might have perceived the same level of threat. It does not ask whether a civilian watching later would agree, and it does not ask whether a better outcome was possible. This distinction is critical. In cases involving vehicles, the legal threshold becomes even more complex. Courts have long recognized that a moving vehicle can constitute a deadly threat, not because it is a weapon by design, but because of its potential force. Officers are trained to assess speed, distance, direction, and escape options within seconds. At the same time, modern policing guidelines often warn against placing oneself in the path of a vehicle. Many policies discourage officers from firing at moving cars unless no other option exists. This is not because danger is absent, but because risk multiplies quickly for officers, occupants, and bystanders. These competing realities sit at the heart of public confusion. From a legal standpoint, an officer may be justified if they reasonably believe a vehicle is being used in a way that threatens life. From a public standpoint, people often ask a different question. Why was lethal force the only outcome? Law does not always answer that question. In the case of Renee Good, federal officials invoked the legal framework of self-defense early. They emphasized threat perception, immediacy, and the speed of events. Within that framework, the shooting was presented as a lawful response to danger. But legality does not operate in isolation. Public trust depends not only on whether a standard is met, but on whether people understand how it was met. When explanations rely heavily on legal language without accompanying clarity, audiences can feel excluded from the reasoning process. This is where law and intuition diverge. Most civilians do not think in terms of reasonable officer standards. They think in terms of space, time, and alternatives. Could someone step back? Could the vehicle stop? Could commands be given? Could force be delayed? These questions are not legal tests. They are moral ones. And when legal explanations do not engage with those moral intuitions, they can feel insufficient, even when they are technically sound. It is also important to understand what self-defense does not require. It does not require proof of intent from the person perceived as a threat. It does not require that the threat be carried out. And it does not require that the outcome be the least harmful possible, only that the response be reasonable at the moment it occurred. This can be difficult to reconcile with public expectations. In high-profile cases, people often expect a narrative of inevitability, that no other outcome was possible. But the law does not demand inevitability. It demands reasonableness under pressure. That gap between what the law requires and what the public expects is not new. It appears whenever state power uses lethal force, and it is amplified when explanations arrive before evidence feels complete. Understanding this legal framework does not resolve the Renee Good case, but it does explain why the term self-defense alone did not end the conversation. Because for many viewers, the question is not whether the law allows a shooting. It is whether the explanation satisfies the gravity of a life lost. In the next segment, we move from law to practice, examining how officers are trained to assess threat, how those assessments unfold in seconds, and why training itself becomes part of the public debate. When law enforcement agencies explain the use of lethal force, they often return to one phrase: training. Training is meant to prepare officers for moments when time collapses, when decisions must be made in seconds, not after reflection. It is designed to create patterns of response under stress, allowing action when hesitation could mean harm. But training does not eliminate ambiguity. It manages it. In high-risk encounters, officers are taught to assess threat through a rapid sequence of cues: distance, movement, direction, proximity to others, and perceived intent. These cues are processed almost instinctively, shaped by repetition and experience. This is especially true in encounters involving vehicles. A vehicle can shift from benign to dangerous in an instant. Officers are trained to recognize acceleration, steering direction, and spatial positioning. At the same time, many departments also teach avoidance, encouraging officers to move out of a vehicle's path whenever possible, precisely because firing at a moving car carries extreme risk. These principles can exist side by side, and that coexistence is where public understanding often breaks down. From the inside, training emphasizes survival. From the outside, it can look like contradiction. Why, people ask, would an officer place themselves in harm's way? Why approach a vehicle closely? Why not step back? These questions assume time. Training assumes compression. In the case involving Renee Good, federal officials later pointed to training and threat assessment to explain the officer's actions. They described a moment where danger was perceived as immediate and unavoidable. But perception under stress is not the same as hindsight. Studies in use of force analysis show that under acute stress, tunnel vision can narrow awareness. Auditory exclusion can mute commands. Motion can feel faster or slower than it objectively is. Training prepares officers to act within this altered perception, but it cannot guarantee alignment with how events appear on video afterward. This mismatch is crucial. Video restores time. Training compresses it. When the public reviews footage, they are not sharing the officer's physiological state. They are watching with distance, repetition, and pause. They see frames, not fear. They analyze, not react. Neither perspective is false, but they are not interchangeable. This is why training explanations often fail to resolve controversy. They answer how an officer might have perceived danger, but not why that perception feels convincing to those outside the uniform. And when explanations rely heavily on training without addressing visible alternatives, skepticism grows. It is also important to acknowledge limits. Training does not absolve responsibility. It provides context, but accountability still depends on whether actions aligned with policy, law, and proportionality. This balance between understanding stress and evaluating outcomes is one of the most difficult challenges in public accountability. If institutions emphasize stress too much, they appear to excuse harm. If they ignore it, they appear unrealistic. In cases like this, the public is not demanding perfection. It is demanding coherence, a sense that training, policy, and outcome align in a way that makes sense beyond institutional language. When that alignment is missing or poorly communicated, trust erodes further. This does not mean the officer acted outside training. It means the explanation has not yet bridged the gap between internal reasoning and external understanding. In the next segment, we examine what happens when that gap widens, how public reaction forms, why protests emerge even before investigations conclude, and how collective memory shapes belief faster than facts can be verified. Public reaction rarely waits for investigations to conclude. In the hours and days following the death of Renee Good, responses began to form across different layers of society. Some were quiet and personal. Others were collective and visible. Together, they reflected something deeper than disagreement over facts. They reflected a trust gap. When lethal force is used by the state, public reaction is shaped not only by what happened, but by what people believe has happened before. Memory plays a powerful role. Prior incidents, unresolved cases, and perceived patterns all influence how new explanations are received. This is why reactions often feel immediate. They are not starting from zero. For many observers, the official explanation, self-defense, was evaluated against a backdrop of similar claims in past cases. Even without direct comparison, the language felt familiar, and familiarity can either reassure or alarm depending on experience. In this case, skepticism emerged quickly, not necessarily because people believed they knew the truth, but because they felt they had seen this structure before. A rapid assertion of justification, limited early transparency, and a call for patience while investigations proceed. For institutions, patience is procedural. For the public, patience is emotional. These two timelines rarely align. As discussion spread across social platforms, the conversation widened. Some focused on legal standards. Others focused on moral responsibility. Some called for calm. Others called for accountability. Importantly, these responses were not uniform, nor were they always coordinated. But they shared a common thread: doubt about completeness. Public trust tends to fracture when people sense that explanations are being delivered to close a conversation rather than to open it. Even when that perception is inaccurate, it can be powerful. This dynamic explains why protests and public statements often emerge before investigations are complete. They are not verdicts, they are signals. Signals that people do not feel included in the process. In Minneapolis, reactions varied across communities and leadership. Some local officials publicly questioned the federal narrative, not to assign guilt, but to demand access, oversight, and clarity. Others urged restraint and patience. Both responses reflected concern for legitimacy. The presence of disagreement itself became part of the story. When authorities speak with one voice, trust can stabilize. When authorities speak past one another, uncertainty grows, and uncertainty invites interpretation. Social media accelerated this process. Short clips, headlines, and commentary condensed complex events into fragments that traveled faster than nuance. Each fragment invited reaction, and each reaction reinforced belief. This is not unique to this case. It is a feature of modern information ecosystems, but it places institutions in a difficult position. Silence is interpreted as concealment. Speed is interpreted as defensiveness. Partial disclosure is interpreted as manipulation. There is no perfect response, yet public trust does not demand perfection. It demands sincerity, transparency, and acknowledgement of uncertainty. When those elements are absent or appear delayed, reaction fills the gap. It is important to note what public reaction does not determine. It does not establish legal truth. It does not replace evidence, and it does not conclude investigations. But it does shape legitimacy. A lawful action that lacks public trust can still destabilize confidence in institutions. Conversely, a transparent process, even amid disagreement, can preserve trust even when outcomes are painful. This is the central tension exposed by the Renee Good case. The question is not whether people should wait for investigations. It is whether institutions can communicate in ways that make waiting feel reasonable. In the next segment, we examine where accountability resides, who investigates federal use of force, how oversight functions across jurisdictions, and why access to information becomes as important as the information itself. When lethal force is used by a private citizen, the path to accountability is relatively clear. Local law enforcement investigates, prosecutors review evidence, courts determine outcomes. When lethal force is used by the state, the process becomes more complex. In the case involving Renee Good, accountability did not begin and end at the local level. Federal agencies, state authorities, and independent investigators all entered the picture, each with different roles, jurisdictions, and limitations. This layered structure is not unusual. It is built into how democracies manage power. But it can be difficult for the public to follow, especially when clarity is scarce. At the federal level, use of force incidents involving federal officers are typically reviewed by internal investigative units and, in some cases, by the FBI. These investigations assess whether actions complied with federal law and agency policy. They are designed to be thorough, but they are also largely opaque while ongoing. At the state and local levels, officials may seek parallel access to evidence or conduct their own reviews. This can include independent prosecutors, oversight boards, or legislative inquiries. Their authority, however, is often limited when federal jurisdiction applies. In this case, tensions emerged early. Local leaders expressed frustration about access, who could review footage, who controlled evidence, and who had authority to speak publicly. Federal officials emphasized procedure and confidentiality. Both sides claimed legitimacy. From the public's perspective, this looked less like coordination and more like separation. And separation fuels suspicion. When agencies investigate themselves, even when done properly, skepticism is predictable. This does not mean investigations are invalid. It means credibility must be earned, not assumed. This is the accountability paradox. Institutions require independence to function. The public requires transparency to trust. Balancing those needs is one of the most difficult challenges in democratic governance. In high-profile cases, the demand for transparency intensifies. People want to know who is asking the questions, who controls the evidence, and what standards are being applied. When answers are delayed or framed narrowly, concern grows, not necessarily because wrongdoing is assumed, but because exclusion is felt. This dynamic played out here. Statements emphasized that investigations were ongoing, that evidence would be reviewed, that conclusions would follow. All of this is procedurally correct, but procedure alone does not satisfy public accountability. People want visibility, not into every detail, but into the process itself. They want assurance that oversight is real, independent, and capable of challenging power if necessary. This is why oversight mechanisms matter. Civilian review boards, inspector generals, independent prosecutors. These structures exist to provide distance between power and judgment. When they are absent, restricted, or poorly explained, confidence weakens. It is also why language matters. When officials emphasize legality without addressing oversight, they appear defensive. When they emphasize investigation without explaining scope, they appear evasive. Even accurate statements can erode trust if they do not meet public expectations for openness. None of this implies guilt. It implies responsibility. Responsibility to explain not just what is being done, but how and by whom. In the Renee Good case, accountability became a second story running alongside the first. One story asked what happened. The other asked who would decide. And until that second story feels resolved, the first remains unsettled in the public mind. This is not a failure of law. It is a test of legitimacy. In democracies, power does not rest solely on authority. It rests on consent, and consent is sustained by trust. In the next segment, we widen the lens, examining similar cases across different countries and contexts, and why this tension between force and trust appears again and again. Cases like the one involving Renee Good often feel singular when they happen. The details are specific, the people are real, the context is local, but the tension they expose is not. Across democracies, incidents involving state use of lethal force tend to follow a familiar arc. An encounter escalates, an explanation is issued, an investigation begins, and public trust is tested, sometimes more severely than the legal system itself. This is not a coincidence, it is a structural pattern. In country after country, governments rely on similar legal frameworks to justify force: self-defense, threat perception, proportional response. These doctrines exist for a reason. They acknowledge danger. They protect officers. They allow the state to function under pressure. Yet public reaction often diverges in strikingly similar ways. Whether in North America, Europe, or parts of Africa and Asia, communities tend to ask the same questions after fatal encounters. Why did it escalate? Were alternatives possible? Who decides whether force was justified? And why does the explanation feel incomplete? The answers vary by jurisdiction, but the doubts echo. One reason is visibility. In the modern world, cameras are nearly everywhere. Encounters that once would have been described are now watched, and watching changes expectations. People compare what they see with what they are told, often across borders. Another reason is institutional memory. High-profile cases accumulate. Each unresolved controversy becomes a reference point for the next. Even when circumstances differ, language overlaps. And when language overlaps, skepticism compounds. This does not mean every case is the same. It means perception travels. A shooting in one country influences how a shooting is received in another. Not because of shared facts, but because of shared concerns about accountability and power. Governments respond differently to this challenge. Some prioritize rapid transparency, releasing footage early, explaining procedures in detail, and acknowledging uncertainty. Others prioritize investigative integrity, restricting information until conclusions are reached. Neither approach is without risk. Early transparency can mislead if context is missing. Delayed disclosure can alienate if trust is already fragile. The balance is difficult and missteps are common. What distinguishes cases that stabilize public trust from those that inflame it is rarely legality alone. It is coherence. A sense that explanations, evidence, and oversight align in a way that feels intelligible beyond institutional boundaries. In places where oversight is visibly independent and well communicated, public reaction often softens over time, even when outcomes are painful. Where oversight appears insular or opaque, distrust persists long after investigations conclude. This is the global lesson. Force without trust erodes legitimacy. Trust without accountability erodes justice. The Renee Good case fits within this broader pattern, not because it mirrors another incident exactly, but because it raises the same structural questions. Questions about who explains force, how explanations are delivered, and whether people feel included in the process. These questions matter because they shape more than reaction. They shape consent. Democratic authority depends not only on law but on the willingness of people to accept outcomes they may not like because they believe the process was fair. When that belief weakens, legitimacy suffers, quietly at first, then visibly. Understanding this global context does not resolve the case at hand. but it explains why it resonates beyond its immediate geography, why people far from Minneapolis paid attention, and why similar debates arise again and again. In the next segment, we return to language, examining how media framing, headlines, and early narratives influence belief, often before evidence can catch up. Before investigations finish, before evidence is fully reviewed, and before conclusions are reached, a different process begins. The first story. In the hours after the death of Renee Good, headlines appeared quickly. Some emphasized the official explanation. Others emphasized the outcome. Each choice of words carried weight. Language does not simply describe events, it frames them. Terms like self-defense, officer-involved shooting, and federal operation are not neutral in how they are received. They signal authority, legitimacy, and closure, even when details remain unresolved. This is not unique to this case. It is a structural feature of modern media. News organizations operate under pressure to be timely, accurate, and responsible. But speed compresses nuance. Early reports rely heavily on official statements, not because of bias, but because they are the first verifiable sources available. As a result, the initial narrative often reflects institutional language. That first narrative matters more than many realize. Psychological research shows that early framing shapes how later information is interpreted. Once a story is categorized, self-defense, accident, justified force, subsequent details are filtered through that lens. Contradictory evidence must work harder to be believed. In the Renee Good case, the phrase self-defense entered public discourse almost immediately. For some, it provided explanation. For others, it felt premature. As more information emerged, video clips, statements from local officials, questions about oversight, the media faced a familiar challenge: how to update a story without destabilizing it. Some outlets adjusted language, others doubled down on early framing. Headlines shifted subtly, but the first impression remained. This is where trust begins to diverge. Audiences do not consume one article. They consume patterns. When they see language repeated across platforms, they infer consensus. When they see disagreement, they infer uncertainty or conflict. Social media accelerates this effect. Headlines are shortened. Context is stripped. Words become signals rather than explanations. A single phrase can circulate globally, detached from its original reporting. This is how narratives harden. Importantly, this does not require misinformation. Accurate statements, when incomplete, can still mislead by omission. And when audiences sense omission, skepticism grows. Journalists are aware of this tension. Many attempt to signal uncertainty with phrases like, according to authorities, or investigation ongoing. But these qualifiers are often lost in secondary sharing. The result is a paradox. Media seeks to inform responsibly. Audiences seek meaning quickly. Between them sits language, doing more work than it can safely carry. This is why later clarifications rarely have the same impact as early headlines. By the time nuance arrives, belief has already formed, and belief, once established, resists revision. In the Renee Good case, this meant that by the time discussions shifted toward oversight, training, and legal standards, many viewers had already decided whether they trusted the explanation. Some felt the media had been too deferential. Others felt it had been too skeptical. Most simply felt unsure. That uncertainty is not failure. It is a reflection of how information moves in moments of crisis. The responsibility of documentary work then is different from breaking news. It is not to be first. It is to be coherent, to slow the story down, to examine how language shaped understanding before evidence could fully speak. This segment is not a critique of journalism, it is an examination of structure. Because when the first story sets the tone, every story that follows must respond to it, whether to reinforce, revise, or resist. In the final segments, we return to what remains unresolved, not to speculate but to clarify the questions that still matter, and why answering them carefully is essential to restoring trust. Amid investigations, statements, and debates, it is easy to lose sight of the simplest truth. A life ended. Before this case became a question of law or a test of institutional trust, Renee Good was a person moving through an ordinary day. She was not a symbol. She did not choose to represent a debate. Her life intersected with state power in a moment she did not control. That intersection carries consequences beyond legality. When people talk about the human cost of state force, they are not dismissing officer safety or legal standards. They are acknowledging that every use of lethal force reverberates outward, into families, communities, and memory. For those closest to Renee, the loss is not abstract. It is immediate and permanent. A voice no longer heard, a presence no longer felt, daily routines altered by absence, grief that does not pause while investigations proceed. This reality exists alongside official processes, not in opposition to them. Public discourse often struggles to hold these truths at once. Discussions shift quickly to justification, policy, and precedent. These conversations matter, but when they eclipse the human dimension entirely, something essential is lost. Respectful acknowledgement is not a verdict, it is recognition. In many cases involving state force, families ask for only one thing: to be seen, to be heard, and to know that the life lost is not reduced to a footnote in a report. They ask for dignity in language, restraint in speculation, and care in how stories are told. This documentary does not attempt to speak for Renee. It does not speculate about her intentions. And it does not define her by the moment of her death. It recognizes her as a person whose life now carries a question larger than itself. For the public, focusing on the human cost serves another purpose. It reminds viewers that debates about power and trust are not theoretical. They are grounded in real outcomes that cannot be undone. This is why language matters so deeply. Phrases like incident and outcome can distance us from consequence. They can sanitize loss. Precision is important, but so is empathy. Holding space for grief does not undermine investigation, it strengthens legitimacy. When institutions acknowledge loss openly, trust has room to breathe. When they do not, anger fills the silence. In the Renee Good case, public reaction was not driven solely by disagreement over facts. It was driven by a sense that the weight of loss had not been fully acknowledged in early explanations. That perception, whether accurate or not, shaped response, and response shapes memory. Years from now, legal conclusions may be reached, reports may be finalized, but collective memory will be shaped as much by tone as by outcome, by whether people felt the process respected the human cost involved. This is the quiet responsibility of documentation. Not to sensationalize, not to accuse, but to remember. As this documentary approaches its conclusion, the remaining task is not to answer every question. Some answers will come through formal processes. Others may never be fully known. What remains is the responsibility to ask the right questions and to ask them with care. In the final segment, we return to those unanswered questions, not to speculate, but to clarify what is still unknown, why it matters, and what restoring trust requires moving forward. By the time investigations conclude, reports are written, and statements are finalized, a different kind of record already exists. Memory. It is shaped not only by facts but by tone, not only by outcomes but by whether people felt included in the process, and not only by what was decided but by how decisions were explained. This documentary began with a question. It ends with several. What standard should exist when the state explains the use of lethal force? Who decides whether an explanation is complete? And how much transparency is required to sustain trust in institutions built on authority? These questions are not accusations. They are responsibilities. In democratic systems, power is granted conditionally. It is expected to protect, to enforce law, and when necessary, to act decisively. But that power is also expected to explain itself, to justify actions in ways that are credible, proportional, and accessible. When explanations satisfy only legal thresholds, they may pass in court. When they satisfy public understanding, they preserve legitimacy. The gap between those two outcomes is where controversy lives. As this case has shown, uncertainty does not always come from a lack of information. Sometimes it comes from the way information is delivered, from how quickly conclusions are stated, from how clearly oversight is described, and from whether institutions acknowledge what people have already seen. No investigation can eliminate all doubt. No explanation can address every question. But processes can be designed to invite trust rather than test it. That means acknowledging uncertainty early rather than presenting certainty that must later be revised. It means explaining not only what is being investigated, but how and by whom. And it means recognizing that public patience is not infinite. It is sustained by communication, not silence. This is not about choosing sides. It is about choosing standards. The questions raised here will not be resolved by one case, one report, or one verdict. They will reappear wherever power meets consequence, wherever force is justified by fear, and wherever explanations are offered to communities that carry memory forward. What happens next matters, not just for those directly involved, but for how institutions are understood moving forward. If conclusions are reached transparently, trust can recover, even amid disagreement. If they are reached quietly, skepticism can linger, regardless of legality. This is the quiet truth at the center of the story. Democracies are not sustained by force alone. They are sustained by consent, and consent depends on whether people believe that power is accountable not just to law, but to the public it serves. The questions raised by this case remain open not because answers are impossible, but because clarity is still in progress. And until clarity arrives, the responsibility of documentation is simple. To ask carefully, to speak precisely, and to remember that behind every explanation is a life that cannot be restored by policy, precedent, or process. This is not the end of the conversation. It is the record of how it began,